Write in the comments which country you're watching from and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. History remembers him as Osman the Young, a boy of 14 who ascended the mightiest throne on earth, dreaming of reforms that would rival Alexander. He saw a rot at the heart of his empire, the Janissaries, once elite troops, now a corrupt power unto themselves. He dared to challenge them, but in the cold stone of the Yedikule Dungeons, his ambition met a brutal end. This is the story of how a sultan's dream to save his empire led him to be strangled by his own slaves, a cautionary tale of a revolution that devoured its master. In the heart of the 17th century world, within the labyrinthine walls of the Topkapi Palace, a new kind of prince was being forged. He was Osman, son of Sultan Ahmed I, born in 1604 into an empire at the zenith of its power, yet riddled with the first signs of a deep, systemic decay. Unlike the princes of old who were sent to govern provinces, honing their skills in the crucible of real-world administration, Osman's world was one of opulent confinement. He was a product of a new, fearful tradition. The age of princely civil wars had ended, replaced by the silent terror of the Kafes, the cage. Here, brothers and potential heirs to the throne were kept in luxurious imprisonment, their minds often withering from isolation and the constant dread of the executioner's silk cord. Though Osman himself was spared the worst of this isolation, the system's shadow loomed over his entire existence. His mother, Mahfiruz, was quickly eclipsed by the formidable Kosem Sultan, leaving the young prince politically adrift in the treacherous currents of the harem. But this isolation bred a unique strength. Denied a role in governance, Osman turned inward, to the world of books and ideas. He became a polyglot, mastering Latin, Greek, and Italian, alongside the traditional Persian and Arabic. He was a gifted poet, his verses filled with a yearning for action and a sharp critique of the world he observed. From his gilded prison, he saw it all: the grand viziers who enriched themselves while the treasury dwindled, the palace eunuchs who wielded power from the shadows, and most ominously, the arrogant swagger of the Janissaries, the so-called slaves of the Sultan who had become the masters of the state. This education, so different from that of his predecessors, created a ruler who was intellectually brilliant, fiercely proud, and profoundly contemptuous of the corrupt order. He was a mind sharpened to a razor's edge, waiting for the moment to cut away the rot he saw consuming his birthright. But it also made him dangerously unaware of the art of political compromise, a fatal flaw for a man destined to rule. The year is 1617. Sultan Ahmed I, Osman's father, dies suddenly, not yet 30 years old. His death throws the empire into a constitutional crisis. For centuries, the brutal law of fratricide had governed succession. The new sultan would execute his brothers to secure the throne. But Ahmed, haunted by the thought of killing his own kin, had replaced this bloody tradition with the principle of seniority. The throne would now pass to the eldest living male of the Ottoman dynasty. This humane reform had a catastrophic, unintended consequence. The new sultan was not one of Ahmed's vigorous sons, but his brother, Mustafa, a man who had spent 14 years locked away in the Kafes. The psychological toll had been immense. Mustafa I was brought forth, blinking in the light of a world he no longer understood, his mind shattered by fear and isolation. He was utterly unfit to rule, wandering the palace, scattering coins to the fish in the Bosphorus, and attempting to flee his own coronation. The empire, for the first time, was rudderless. The state's highest officials, the Pasha and the Ulama, watched in horror. This could not stand. After a chaotic reign of just 96 days, a swift, bloodless coup was orchestrated. Mustafa was gently guided back to his gilded prison. The court now needed a sultan, a mind sharp enough to govern. Their eyes fell upon Ahmed's eldest son, the brilliant, restless boy of 14. In February 1618, Osman was summoned. He was no longer a prince in a cage, but the Padishah, the shadow of God on earth. As he ascended the throne, A boy in a man's role, the weight of a global empire settled on his slender shoulders. For the court conspirators who placed him there, he was a solution, a bright but malleable youth they hoped to control. They looked at him and saw a pawn. They had no idea they had just crowned a revolutionary, a puritanical idealist whose iron will was about to collide with the immovable corruption of the age. To understand the tragedy of Osman II, one must first understand the Janissaries. They were the empire's sword, but a sword that had begun to turn against its master. Forged centuries earlier from the devoured, a levy of Christian boys converted to Islam, they were raised to be the Sultan's personal slave soldiers, celibate, fanatically loyal, and the most feared infantry in the world. Their loyalty was absolute because their entire existence depended on the Sultan. But by the early 17th century, this iron discipline had rusted through. The corps had become a bloated, hereditary caste. Janissaries now married, enrolled their sons into the ranks, and engaged in commerce, becoming shopkeepers and artisans who viewed military service as a part-time inconvenience. They were no longer the empire's elite warriors. They were a powerful political syndicate, a Praetorian guard that could make or break sultans at will. Their power was rooted in the capital, Istanbul, where their mere presence was a constant, simmering threat. Every new sultan was forced to pay them a handsome accession donative, a bribe for their loyalty that drained the imperial treasury. They were kingmakers, and they knew it. Young Osman, with his sharp, analytical mind, saw them not as the guardians of the empire, but as its most dangerous parasites. He witnessed their insolence in the palace courtyards, heard the stories of their indiscipline on the battlefield, and seethed at their insatiable demands for gold. To him, they were the living embodiment of the decay he was determined to reverse. He, a descendant of Mehmed the Conqueror and Suleiman the Magnificent, was expected to bow to the will of these glorified tradesmen in uniform. This was an intolerable offense to his imperial pride. A deep, mutual contempt began to fester. The Janissaries saw a boy playing sultan, an arrogant intellectual who had never known war. Osman saw a cancerous tumor on the body of the state. Neither side understood the true resolve of the other. This chasm of misunderstanding was the fault line upon which his entire reign would be built, and the abyss into which he was destined to fall. Osman II was not a ruler who would wait. From the moment he took the throne, he moved with a speed and decisiveness that shocked the established order. The era of the reclusive sultan, hidden away in the harem and ruling through viziers, was over. Osman broke with recent tradition and began personally presiding over the divan, the imperial council. He sat in the open, his piercing gaze fixed on his ministers, questioning their decisions, scrutinizing their reports. The message was unmistakable. Authority was returning to the Sultan himself. His next target was the sprawling, corrupt palace bureaucracy. He slashed extravagant pensions, dismissed incompetent officials, and altered the jurisdictions of the highest legal authorities, the Kadiaskas, to curb their power. He challenged the influence of his stepmother, the powerful Kosum Sultan, attempting to curtail the political meddling of the harem that had become so prevalent. He was attempting to wind the clock back to a golden age, to restore a meritocracy that had long since faded into myth. These actions sent tremors through Istanbul's corridors of power. The old guard, who had grown fat on the lax rule of his predecessors, began to see this young reformer not as a savior, but as a grave threat to their vested interests. He was upsetting a delicate balance of corruption that had served them well for decades. But Osman's most radical and ultimately fatal ambition was yet to be revealed. He believed the heart of the empire's problems lay with its military. To understand its weakness, he had to see it himself. He made a momentous decision. He would personally lead the Ottoman army on a campaign against Poland. This was a startling move. The last sultan to lead from the front had been Suleiman the Magnificent, over half a century earlier. For Osman, it was a chance to win glory, to restore the image of the warrior sultan, and, most importantly, to assess the true fighting quality of the Janissaries he so despised. He was marching to war, but it was a war on two fronts, one against a foreign power, and a far more dangerous undeclared war against his own army. While the grand theatre of state played out in the divan, the true heart of power and of conspiracy beat within the silent gilded walls of the Topkapi harem. And it was here that Osman II made his most dangerous enemies. The young sultan was a creature of startling modernity, chafing against the chains of tradition. He saw the harem not as the sacred core of the dynasty, but as a gilded cage, a source of intrigue and decay that insulated the ruler from his people. His predecessors had sired heirs with enslaved concubines, a system that concentrated all familial power in the sultan and his mother, the Valide Sultan. Osman shattered this century-old custom. He chose his wives from the freeborn Turkish elite, marrying the daughters of the Sheikh al-Islam and another high official. To the court, this was an earthquake. It was a signal that Osman intended to create a new power base, one independent of the palace slaves and the established order. The most powerful woman in the empire, his stepmother, Kosem Sultan, watched with cold fury. She was the mother of his younger half-brothers, including the future Sultan Murad IV. Osman's actions, his talk of limiting the harem's influence, and his marriage into Turkish nobility, were a direct threat to her own power and the succession of her sons. She was a master of palace politics, a spider at the center of a vast web of influence. The whispers began as faint murmurs in secluded chambers, carried by eunuchs and loyal servants. They spoke of a sultan who disdained the traditions of the House of Osman, who preferred the company of common men to his own court, who was dangerously impulsive. Kosem did not need to shout treason. She merely had to nurture the seeds of discontent that Osman himself was so carelessly sowing. Every breach of protocol, every stern command, every reformist dream was twisted into an accusation of tyranny and arrogance. The harem, once his nursery, was becoming the crucible of his ruin. Every great sultan was forged in the fires of war. This was the unwritten law of the Ottoman dynasty. For Osman II, a young ruler desperate to cement his authority and enact his radical reforms, a glorious military campaign was not just an option, it was a necessity. His eyes turned north, to the vast and troublesome border with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The official casus belli was simple enough: Polish meddling in the Ottoman vassal states of Moldavia and Wallachia, and the incessant bloody raids of their Cossack allies into Ottoman territory. A previous Ottoman expedition had ended in disaster at the Battle of Sakura, a humiliation that demanded vengeance. But for Osman, this was more than a punitive expedition. It was a grand gambit, a high-stakes play for the soul of his empire. He saw the Janissary Corps, once the elite shock troops of the Sultan, as a decadent, corrupt, and politically dangerous institution. They were kingmakers and kingbreakers, more interested in their pay and privileges than in battlefield discipline. His plan was audacious, bordering on revolutionary. He would lead the army to Poland himself, a tradition long abandoned by his recent predecessors. He would witness the Janissaries' failings firsthand, their cowardice and insubordination, in the heat of a major campaign. He would expose their weakness to the entire empire. Then, upon returning to Istanbul cloaked in victory, he would have the political capital to dissolve the corps entirely. He would replace them with a new army, a loyal force recruited from the Turkish heartlands of Anatolia and the Levant. It was a breathtakingly risky strategy. He was wagering his entire reign, his life's work, on the outcome of a single war. He would either return a conqueror, a true Ghazi king with the power to remake the state in his own image, or he would return diminished, his authority shattered, and at the mercy of the very soldiers he sought to destroy. The fate of the empire would be decided on the cold plains of Eastern Europe. In the spring of 1621, the imperial standard was raised. A colossal Ottoman army, perhaps over 100,000 strong, began its slow, inexorable march from Istanbul. It was a river of men and steel, of cavalry, infantry, and the immense siege cannons that were the pride of the empire. At its head rode Sultan Osman II, resplendent in his armor, the first sultan to lead a campaign in person in over 2 decades. The initial mood was one of supreme confidence. This was the mighty Ottoman war machine, mobilized to crush a European kingdom. But the heavens themselves seemed to conspire against the young sultan. The march north was plagued by torrential rains, turning the roads into impassable quagmires. Then, an unusually severe and early winter descended upon them. Snow fell in late spring, a bitter, biting cold that sapped the morale of soldiers accustomed to warmer climes. Supplies dwindled, and disease began to creep through the camps. The arduous journey exposed the deep fractures within the army. The Janissaries, forced into a long and brutal campaign under a commander they already distrusted, grew sullen and insubordinate. They saw Osman not as an inspiring warrior king, but as a harsh and unforgiving taskmaster. He publicly berated his commanders for delays and enforced discipline with an iron fist, a stark contrast to the lax standards they had become used to. Stories circulated through the ranks of his disdain for them, of his plans to replace them. The march to Khotin became a funeral procession for the army's loyalty. Every grueling mile, every frozen night, every meager ration chipped away at the bond between the Sultan and his slave soldiers. He believed he was hardening them for the battle to come, forging a new army through shared hardship. In reality, he was alienating them completely. By the time the weary, half-frozen Ottoman host finally arrived before the walls of the Khotin fortress on the Dniester River, they were not a unified force poised for victory, but a disgruntled and divided mass, simmering with a resentment that was becoming far more dangerous than any Polish cannon. The fortress of Khotin was not an imposing stone castle of legend, but a formidable bastion of earth and timber, expertly modernized and defended by a combined force of Polish-Lithuanian troops and their hardened Cossack allies. They were outnumbered, but they were dug in, determined, and commanded by the brilliant, dying Grand Hetman, Jan Karol Chodkiewicz. What Osman had envisioned as a swift, glorious victory devolved into a brutal, bloody siege. For over a month, the Ottomans threw themselves against the fortress walls. The grand cannons roared, shaking the very earth, but the earthen ramparts absorbed much of their fury. Wave after wave of Janissaries and provincial troops were sent into the breach, only to be met by a storm of musket fire and a ferocious defense. The casualties were horrific. Osman, desperate to prove his martial valor, often rode into the thick of the fighting, arrows striking the ground around him. But his personal bravery could not compensate for his army's flagging morale and the enemy's unbreakable will. He watched with mounting fury as his elite Janissaries faltered, sometimes refusing direct orders to charge into the meat grinder. He executed commanders for their failures, hoping to inspire fear where he could not inspire loyalty. It had the opposite effect. The soldiers saw a desperate tyrant sacrificing them for his own vanity. The fortress became a symbol of his impotence. Every failed assault was another crack in his authority, another piece of his imperial aura flaking away. The great Sultan, the shadow of God on earth, could not break this one fortress. By early October, with winter setting in for good and his army decimated by combat and disease, a humiliated Osman was forced to accept a peace treaty. It was a stalemate, not a victory. He had failed. He had marched his grand army across half a continent for nothing. He had not won his glory, nor had he definitively proven the Janissaries' incompetence. He had only demonstrated his own. As the sullen army began its long, bitter retreat, Osman knew he was returning to Istanbul, not as a conqueror, but as a failure. And in the Ottoman world, a failed sultan was a sultan on borrowed time. The snows came early to the fields of Khotin in 1621, blanketing the living and the dead in a shroud of white. For 5 brutal weeks, the Ottoman army, led by the young Sultan Osman II himself, had thrown itself against the fortified Polish-Lithuanian camp. He had envisioned a glorious conquest, a victory to rival his ancestors, a triumph that would cement his authority and silence the whispers of his youth. Instead, he witnessed a spectacle of decay. The Janissaries, the supposed elite of the empire, the formidable slave soldiers who had once made Europe tremble, were a shadow of their former selves. They moved with a lethargy born of arrogance, refusing direct orders and complaining endlessly about the harsh conditions. In the biting cold, Osman saw them huddling in their tents, more concerned with their pay and comfort than with the honor of the Sultan. He led charges himself, his youthful idealism a stark contrast to their cynical reluctance. He saw his best commanders fall, not to the enemy's valor, but to the indiscipline of their own troops. The final treaty was a stalemate, a hollow agreement that allowed both sides to claim victory while knowing the truth. The Ottomans would withdraw, their borders secured, but their ambitions shattered. For Osman, this was no victory. It was a profound, soul-crushing defeat. As he rode away from the blood-soaked fields, he didn't see the retreating enemy or the territorial lines on a map. He saw the rot at the heart of his empire, a cancer festering in the barracks of his own personal guard. The campaign had cost a fortune in gold and an ocean of blood, all for a piece of paper that confirmed the status quo. The victory was ashes in his mouth, the cheers of his men a hollow echo of failure. A cold, hard certainty began to form in the young Sultan's mind. This could never happen again. The instrument of empire was broken, and he, the Sultan, would be the one to reforge it or die trying. Returning to Constantinople was not a hero's welcome. The grand procession felt forced, the cheers of the crowd muted. The capital could sense the truth behind the official proclamations of victory. The campaign had been a grueling, expensive failure, and the blame was being laid squarely at the feet of the Janissaries. But for Osman, public opinion was secondary. The fire he had felt at Khotin had not cooled. It had forged itself into a core of pure, unyielding resolve. The boy who went to war was gone, replaced by a monarch who had seen the abyss and was now determined to close it. He moved with a chilling deliberation. His first act was to publicly shame the Janissary Agas he held responsible for the debacle. He stripped them of their commands, their wealth, their honor. Next, he struck at their privileges. He reduced their pay, citing the strain on the imperial treasury, a treasury they had helped to drain through their inaction. He then ordered the closure of the coffeehouses and wine shops near their barracks. These were not mere social spaces. They were the nerve centers of Janissary power, dens of gossip, intrigue and sedition, where plots were hatched over steaming cups of coffee. By shutting them down, he was attempting to sever their lines of communication, to isolate them. Each move was a calculated provocation, a test of their power and his own. He was no longer trying to win their loyalty. He was declaring a silent war. In the quiet halls of Topkapi Palace, the young Sultan became a solitary figure, poring over military treatises and histories of his ancestors. He was searching for a new way, a path to restore the power that had been usurped by the very men sworn to protect him. The seeds of vengeance were not planted in a fit of rage, but with the cold, patient hands of a gardener tending to a bed of poison. He was cultivating a reckoning, and he knew it would require a harvest of blood. Osman's campaign of punishments and restrictions against the Janissaries was merely the opening salvo. He knew that chipping away at their power was not enough. A diseased limb cannot be healed. It must be amputated. His conclusion was as simple as it was revolutionary, an idea so dangerous it had not been attempted for centuries. He would abolish the Janissary corps entirely. But a sultan cannot simply dismiss an army of thousands that controls the capital. He needed a counterforce, a new military loyal not to the barracks, but to the throne. He needed a secret army. The plan began to take shape in the deepest secrecy. Under the guise of routine provincial administration, Osman dispatched his most trusted commanders to the heartlands of the empire. They traveled to Anatolia, to Syria, to Egypt, far from the prying eyes of Istanbul. Their mission was to recruit a new type of soldier. Not the devshirmi boys, taken as tribute and raised in the capital, but freeborn Muslim Turks, Kurds, and Arabs, men whose loyalty was to their faith and their sultan, untainted by the corrupt politics of the capital. Funds were secretly diverted from the imperial treasury. Arms and provisions were stockpiled in secure locations across Anatolia. A new army, numbering in the tens of thousands, was being raised in the shadows. This was an act of supreme rebellion by a sovereign against his own state apparatus. It was a gamble that risked plunging the empire into civil war. Rumours, like whispers of smoke, began to drift back to Constantinople. The Janissaries, feeling the Sultan's cold disdain and hearing tales of recruitment in the east, grew paranoid. Their informers spoke of new regiments being drilled, of vast sums of gold moving towards Anatolia. The tension in the city became a palpable, living thing. The Janissaries began to sharpen their swords, not for a foreign enemy, but for the one who sat on the throne. They understood what Osman was doing. He was building the instrument of their destruction, and they would not wait idly for the blow to fall. Osman's secret army was a sword being forged in the provinces, but he needed a way to unsheath it and bring it to Constantinople. He could not simply march on his own capital. That would be an open declaration of civil war, a move that would alienate the clergy and the political class. He needed a pretext, a justification so grand and unimpeachable that it would mask his true intentions. He found it in the ultimate expression of piety, the Hajj, the sacred pilgrimage to Mecca. He announced to a stunned court his intention to lead a pilgrimage, something no reigning sultan had done in living memory. The official narrative was one of spiritual devotion, a young ruler seeking divine favor for his empire. He would travel with a massive retinue, an honor guard befitting the Caliph of Islam. The deception was brilliant in its audacity. The pilgrimage route would take him directly through Anatolia, the very region where his new recruits were being gathered. Under the holy banner of the Hajj, he could assemble his new army, not as rebels, but as a legitimate pilgrim's escort. Once united, this formidable force would follow him back to Constantinople, where he would finally have the power to enact his ultimate reform, the utter annihilation of the Janissaries. But the deception was too thin for those who knew how to see. The Grand Vizier and the Sheikh al-Islam, the highest religious authority, were deeply suspicious. Why now? Why take such a risk, leaving the capital vulnerable? The Janissaries were not fooled for a moment. They saw the plan for exactly what it was, a death warrant disguised as a holy journey. They knew that if Osman left the city, he would return as their executioner. The announcement of the pilgrimage was not a sign of the Sultan's piety. It was the final, irrevocable challenge. The lines were drawn. The Sultan had played his hand, and the Janissaries now had to play theirs. The sacred journey to Mecca was about to become a highway to rebellion. The winter of 1622 was colder than any in memory, but the chill that gripped Istanbul had little to do with the weather. It was a coldness of the soul, a frost of resentment that crept from the Janissary barracks into the coffee houses, and from the pulpits of the mosques into the halls of power. Sultan Osman II, the young, brilliant, and fatally arrogant sovereign, was oblivious to the true depth of this freeze. He saw the discontent, but dismissed it as the grumbling of a spoiled and obsolete military class. Following the humiliating Polish campaign, where the Janissaries had shown more interest in their pay than in victory, Osman's contempt for them had solidified into a secret, radical plan. He would travel to the sacred lands of Mecca and Medina, a pilgrimage that would serve as the perfect cover. Along the way, in Anatolia, Syria, and Egypt, he would raise a new army, a loyal force of Turks and Turkomans, uncorrupted by the politics of the capital, an army that would answer to him alone. This new force would replace the Janissaries, shattering their centuries-old power. But secrets in the Ottoman court were like water poured on marble. They spread everywhere, seeping into every crack. The Janissaries heard the whispers. The Sipahi cavalry, also slated for obsolescence, heard them too. The ulama, the religious establishment whom Osman had alienated with his modernizing zeal and his disregard for their counsel, began to frame the Sultan's plan not as a military reform, but as a heresy. They preached that he was abandoning the city of the caliphs, turning his back on the heart of the empire. The Grand Vizier, Dilava Pasha, and the Sultan's other confidants warned him of the rising tide of anger. They begged him to postpone the pilgrimage, to appease the soldiers, to make a gesture of reconciliation. But Osman, blinded by the certainty of youth and the absolute power he believed he wielded, refused. He saw their caution as cowardice. In his mind, the storm was a fiction, a phantom conjured by old men afraid of change. He failed to understand that in the twisting streets of his capital, the phantom was becoming flesh, and it was sharpening its blades. May 18th, 1622. The day began like any other, but the air was electric with unspoken tension. The final preparations for Osman's departure were underway, the imperial tents already pitched at Üsküdar across the Bosphorus. For the Janissaries, this was the final proof. The Sultan was truly abandoning them. The signal for rebellion, ancient and deeply symbolic, was given. In the Et Meydana, the great square before their barracks, the huge bronze cauldrons used to cook their daily rations were seized and overturned. The clatter of metal on stone was the death knell of a sultan's reign. It was a declaration of war. From their barracks they poured, a torrent of armed, furious men. They were joined by the Sipahis, by theological students, and by a city mob sensing the collapse of authority. Their first targets were the men they blamed for poisoning the Sultan's mind. They marched on the palaces of the Grand Vizier Dilava Pasha and the other high officials, their roars echoing through the city. "Give us the heads of our enemies." Inside Topkapi Palace, Osman was trapped. The first reports of the uprising were met with his characteristic disdain. He ordered the Bostancı, his palace guards, to disperse the rabble. But the Bostancıs, seeing the sheer scale of the mob, refused. Panic began to set in. The Sultan, who just hours before had commanded an empire, was now a prisoner in his own home. The rebels reached the imperial gate, demanding the execution of 7 of his closest advisors. In a fatal display of loyalty and defiance, Osman refused. He would not sacrifice his men. It was a noble stance, but a catastrophic political miscalculation. His refusal was seen not as strength, but as confirmation of his guilt. The mob's anger, already a raging fire, exploded into an inferno. They were no longer petitioning their sultan. They were coming to judge him. The roar of the mob breached the sacred silence of the Topkapi Palace. The rebels, their fury unappeased, stormed the outer courts. Osman II, the shadow of God on earth, was now a fugitive. He and his few remaining loyalists scurried through the labyrinthine corridors of the vast palace, searching for a place to hide, a moment to think. His authority had vanished, blown away like dust in the wind. The rebels, now in control of the palace grounds, made a decision that would seal Osman's fate and plunge the empire into a bizarre new chapter. They surged towards the Kafes, the cage, a set of opulent chambers within the palace where potential heirs to the throne were kept in gilded confinement. There, they found Mustafa I, Osman's uncle, a man who had been deposed years earlier for his severe mental instability. For years, he had languished in the shadows, his mind broken by a life of isolation and terror. The rebels dragged the bewildered, terrified Mustafa from his prison, paraded him to the throne room, and proclaimed him sultan for the second time. This single act was a masterstroke of revolutionary politics. By placing a new sultan on the throne, they had officially and legally deposed Osman. He was no longer a monarch to be negotiated with. He was a traitor to be hunted. The search intensified. The Janissaries, who once would have died to protect the Sultan's privacy, now kicked down the doors of the harem, their boots defiling the sacred space. Osman, hearing the shouts getting closer, was finally convinced to make a last desperate plea. He appeared before a group of Janissary officers, a holy Quran in his hand, his youthful face a mask of desperation. "What is my crime?" he cried. "I am your Padishah. Yesterday you were loyal to me. What has changed today?" But it was too late. For the men before him, he was no longer their sovereign. He was merely Osman, the man who had tried to destroy them. They seized him. The hunt was over. The capture of a sultan was an act without precedent. His humiliation was just beginning. Osman was not granted the dignity of his former station. He was stripped of his imperial turban, dressed in common clothes, and hoisted onto a decrepit horse. They paraded him through the streets of Istanbul, the same streets where he had once ridden in glorious procession. The citizens who had cheered him now jeered him, their taunts a bitter testament to the fragility of power. His destination was the Yedikule fortress, the infamous prison of the Seven Towers, a place reserved for deposed princes and foreign enemies. It was a place from which few ever returned. As the pathetic procession moved through the city, a new power structure was forming around the puppet Sultan Mustafa. The new Grand Vizier was Kara Davud Pasha, a man of ruthless ambition and the brother-in-law of the new Sultan. Davud Pasha understood a fundamental truth. A living, deposed sultan, especially one as young and vigorous as Osman, would forever be a rallying point for loyalists. He could not be allowed to live. The journey to Yedikule was a sham. The procession was diverted to the Topkapi, a mosque within the Janissary barracks, a place that was the very heart of his enemy's power. There, in a small, unremarkable room belonging to the Janissary the final act of betrayal was set in motion. Osman was pushed inside. The door was barred. He was alone with his executioners. These were not foreign assassins, but his own subjects, his own soldiers, led by Davud Pasha himself. The law of the dynasty forbade the shedding of royal blood, so the instrument of death was to be a silk cord. In that cramped, dark room, far from the gilded halls of Topkapi, the 17-year-old sultan fought for his life with the ferocity of a cornered animal. But he was outnumbered. It was here, in the garden of his chief military officer, that the ultimate promise of protection was transformed into the ultimate act of treason. The world had inverted. The sun, moon, and stars had fallen from the sky. One moment, Osman II was the Padishah, the shadow of God on earth, master of legions and continents. The next, he was prey. Dragged from his hiding place, the young sultan was thrust into the heart of the storm he had sought to quell. The Janissaries, once his sword and shield, were now his captors, their faces contorted with a feral glee. They brought him not to the sublime halls of the divan, but to the Topkapi, the central mosque of their barracks, a place of soldierly prayer, now transformed into a tribunal of rebellion. Here, the carefully constructed edifice of imperial majesty was systematically demolished. His turban, the symbol of his authority, was torn from his head. His fine kaftan, woven with the threads of power, was ripped from his shoulders, leaving him exposed and shivering in the May air. Every insult, every spit and curse was a hammer blow against the divine right he had embodied since childhood. He was no longer a sovereign, but a spectacle. The men who once trembled at his gaze now jeered, mocking his youth, his ambition, his failures. They paraded him like a common criminal, a boy who had dared to dream of an empire beyond their control. This was not merely a deposition, it was a ritualistic stripping of identity. In that chaotic mosque, surrounded by the roars of the mob, Osman experienced the profound terror of absolute powerlessness. He was a god dethroned, a lion caged, forced to witness the savage dismantling of his own mystique. The psychological shock was immense, a descent from the pinnacle of human authority into the deepest abyss of public shame. His pleas for mercy were lost in the din, his imperial voice now just the desperate cry of a terrified young man. As Osman's world collapsed, the rebels faced a critical question. Who would now occupy the throne? Their answer was not a statesman or a warrior, but a ghost from the past. They stormed the palace, their objective a forgotten chamber where a man had been locked away from the world. This was Mustafa I, Osman's uncle, the sultan who had been deposed years earlier for his profound mental instability. The man they found was a shadow, his mind shattered by years of isolation and fear. He was reportedly discovered cowering in a corner, terrified by the sudden intrusion of light and noise. This was the man the Janissaries chose to be their new Padishah. The scene was a grotesque parody of a coronation. They dragged the trembling, incoherent Mustafa to the throne room, the very seat of imperial power he could no longer comprehend. The grand viziers and pashas, men of state and war, were forced to prostrate themselves before a sovereign who could barely speak his own name. He was a puppet, and his strings were held by the mutineers and his mother, Halime Sultan, a woman of relentless ambition who saw her son's madness as her own path back to power. The restoration of Mustafa was a moment of supreme irony and tragedy for the Ottoman state. In their fury against a reformer who they deemed too radical, too forward-thinking, the Janissaries had replaced him with his polar opposite, a symbol of regression and chaos. The empire, which Osman had tried to steer towards a new future, was now in the hands of a man lost in the labyrinth of his own broken mind. The highest office in the Islamic world was now occupied by a void, a chilling testament to the utter breakdown of order and the triumph of raw, anarchic force over vision and authority. The humiliation was not over. For Osman, the final journey began. It was not a royal procession with banners and fanfare, but a parade of shame. The rebels mounted the deposed sultan on a common, dilapidated horse, a nag, some chronicles say, and led him through the crowded streets of Constantinople. The city that had once celebrated his accession now stared, a mixture of pity, scorn, and fear on the faces of the populace. This was the ultimate degradation, the fallen emperor displayed as a trophy to the very people he had ruled. His destination was a place of dread, a name that echoed with the whispers of fallen princes and executed viziers. The Yedikule fortress, the 7 towers. This was no palace. It was a grim, formidable state prison on the edge of the city, its stone walls a final, unbreachable barrier between a prisoner and the world. As the heavy gates creaked shut behind him, the last vestiges of hope must have evaporated. The opulence of Topkapi Palace, with its sprawling gardens and gilded chambers, was now a distant memory, replaced by the cold, damp stone of a dungeon cell. Here, in the suffocating silence, the reality of his fate would have settled upon him with crushing weight. He was just 19 years old. He had dreamed of rivaling Alexander, of forging a new army, of revitalizing a great empire. Now, he was alone, abandoned by his court, betrayed by his soldiers, and imprisoned by the forces of reaction. The 7 Towers was more than a prison. It was a symbol of the end. It was the place where imperial ambition went to die, where the whispered plots of the powerful culminated in a silent, brutal finality. For Osman, entering its gates was the final step in his descent from the throne of the world to a cold stone floor. The end came with the chilling abruptness of a headsman's axe. In the dark confines of his cell in the Yedikule fortress, Osman was not to be granted a long imprisonment. The new regime, fragile and illegitimate, could not afford to have a living, breathing alternative to their mad sultan. The new Grand Vizier, Kara Davud Pasha, a man whose rise was owed entirely to the rebellion, knew that Osman's continued existence was a threat. He arrived at the fortress with a small group of assassins. What followed was not a clean, swift execution. It was a desperate, primal struggle for life. When the executioners entered his cell, Osman, young and strong, fought back with the ferocity of a cornered animal. He was a sultan, a warrior, and he would not die meekly. The small stone room became a scene of horrific violence. For several minutes, the teenager held his own against multiple assailants, a testament to the strength that had once promised to reshape an empire. But the odds were impossible. Overpowered and pinned to the ground, the instrument of royal execution was produced, the bowstring. In Ottoman tradition, the blood of the Sultan was sacred and could not be spilled. Strangulation was the grim alternative. As the cord tightened around his neck, the last moments of Osman II were a brutal agony of betrayal and suffocation. His dreams of a new order, of a disciplined army, of a renewed caliphate were extinguished in that squalid cell. To prove their deed was done, the assassins committed one final barbaric act. They cut off one of his ears and presented it to Halime Sultan and the new puppet ruler, Mustafa. The young reformer was dead. His murder sent a shockwave through the empire, a terrifying precedent that a sultan could be so brutally deposed and killed by his own soldiers. The strangled breath of Osman II was a death rattle for an age of imperial ambition and a dark omen for the centuries to come.